Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. I'm Maggie Lawson, the woman who pawned her wedding ring in 2002 to buy a mildewed hall in Newark and built Lawson hospitality from bleach balance sheets and sleepless nights. And on the day my son and his bride let their planner tell me I was trash and uninvited from the $300,000 wedding my company was funding, I opened the contracts I wrote, signed one order that pulled our hotel venue, catering, lighting, and cars, and watched a perfect day fold quietly. By afternoon, a hallway video caught the word trash in her own voice, and the internet did what it does. And before sunset at Harborview, I tore a draft that would have handed my son 20% of my company because blood without respect is a debt I won't pay. Then a young Brooklyn teacher walked into my office with white daisies, and one small word Mom and I understood. This was never about money, it was about dignity, the boundary I should have drawn years ago, and the cost I stopped paying the moment I chose myself. The phone on my desk buzzed just as I was finishing a review of the quarterly projections. I was sitting in my office on the 32nd floor of Lawson Hospitality headquarters in Midtown Manhattan. The skyline spread out before me like glass and steel stretching toward the river. At 62 years old, I had long since grown used to numbers on a page, but I still found comfort in the rhythm of balance sheets. My assistant slipped her head inside the door and said quietly that Caitlin Moore from Elegant Events was on the line. I frowned. Caitlin and I rarely spoke unless coordination between our companies required it. I pressed the button, picked up the receiver, and waited. Her voice came smooth, practiced with a careful tone that made me immediately suspicious. She said she hoped she was not interrupting anything too important. I told her to continue. For a brief second, there was hesitation, as if she was preparing to deliver something sharp. Then the words came. Your son Daniel and his fiancée Olivia have decided they do not want you at the wedding. They said you are trash. The office fell silent around me. I could hear only the faint hum of the city below the muffled horn of a cab, the steady whir of the air system through the vents. Trash. The word struck like a blade. I repeated it in my head, unsure if I had heard it correctly. Caitlin's voice softened as if she regretted being the messenger. She explained that they wanted an atmosphere of elegance and dignity, and they feared my presence would detract from their vision. She spoke with no malice of her own, but the words landed like blows all the same. My son Daniel, 34 years old, the boy I raised alone when his father walked away, had joined his bride in labeling me disposable. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out at the skyline. The Empire State Building was just visible in the distance, but in my eyes it blurred into nothing. I had poured my life into this city, into banquet halls and hotels, and transportation fleets, into every detail of Lawson hospitality. Every contract signed had been a promise for Daniel's future, and yet I was no longer welcome at the very celebration that should have bound us together. I said nothing, letting the silence fill the space. Caitlin shifted uneasily, then murmured that she was sorry and disconnected. I lowered the receiver slowly onto its cradle. The line clicked and the office hummed again, indifferent to the wound tearing inside me. My assistant looked in once more, asked if I needed anything. I forced a steady voice and told her I was fine. She left with worry etched on her face. I sat with my hands flat on the oak desk, palms cold against the wood. I thought of the years I had given away. In 2002, I stood in a pawn shop in Newark with my wedding ring in the palm of a stranger's hand. He weighed it as if it were scrap metal. I took the cash without flinching, even though my throat burned with shame, and used it for a down payment on a dilapidated banquet hall. The carpet had smelled of mildew, the walls stained beyond repair, but in my eyes it was possibility. I scrubbed those floors myself, hauled paint buckets, cooked meals on a hot plate in the back office. Daniel sat with his homework in a folding chair until he fell asleep, and I draped a coat over his shoulders. Every sacrifice had a face, his face. I remembered pawning my mother's silver bracelet to cover payroll-skipping vacations so Daniel could travel with friends wearing the same blouses until the fabric thinned while he wore new suits for internships. The pain of those years was not that I endured them, but that I believed they meant something to him. I pushed back from the desk and walked to the tall window. My reflection stared back at me, a woman with silver in her hairlines, carved by time and effort. I whispered the word under my breath. Trash. I thought of the antique dining set I had sold to finance Daniel's first semester at NYU, the storm that had flooded one of our venues, while I stood waist-deep in water, saving what I could. I had faced humiliation in boardrooms where bankers dismissed me as a woman alone, yet nothing pierced me like the contempt of my own son. The ache grew heavier with each memory. I closed my eyes and let the sounds of the city wash over me, traffic voices, the clatter of footsteps far below. Life carried on while mine cracked quietly. I drew in a slow breath and opened my eyes again. The skyline glinted with sunlight towers I had helped finance, rising tall, indifferent, and unshaken. They did not vanish because someone failed to acknowledge them. Neither would I. I returned to my desk, lifted my pen, tapped it once against the margin of the report. The tremor in my hands had stilled. There was a new calm spreading through me, sharp and focused. I had been erased from their story, but I would not underwrite my own erasure. My son and his fiancée had chosen words meant to wound. I chose silence that would soon turn into decision. The phone on the desk remained still, the screen dark. For the first time that morning, I felt no urge to answer to anyone. The insult clung to me, but beneath it something stronger had begun to rise. I sat in the quiet of that office, watching light shift across glass towers, knowing that whatever came next would not be dictated by their cruelty, but by my resolve. I folded my hands, breathed deeply, and let the weight of the insult settle not as defeat, but as a measure of how far I had already traveled. Outside, cabs darted through intersections, pedestrians hurried along crosswalks, unaware that a mother had just been cut from her son's life. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, felt the strength of the city against my skin, and stood rooted in the truth. They could call me trash, but I had built an empire from nothing, and I was not about to let a single word define me. I stepped back, adjusted the lapel of my jacket, and sat once more behind my desk. The projections glowed across the screen, numbers marching upward. They were proof of everything I had sacrificed, everything I had endured, everything that could never be erased by cruelty. I let my gaze linger on them as the city hummed beyond the windows, and I understood that this was not the end. It was only the pause before my answer. I still remembered the weight of that pawn shop air back in 2002, the smell of metal and dust, when I placed my wedding ring on the counter. The man behind the glass barely looked at me as he weighed it, announcing the price as if he were buying scrap. My throat tightened, but I nodded because I had no other choice. That money became the seed for a rundown banquet hall in Newark, a building that smelled of mildew with carpet stained dark, and lights that flickered weakly overhead. To anyone else, it looked like failure. To me, it was the only doorway open. Daniel was only 13 then. He sat on a folding chair in the corner, a spiral notebook balanced on his knees as he tried to focus on algebra, while I dragged trash bags across the sticky floor. His sneakers tapped nervously against the concrete. I told him to keep studying, that one day he would understand why I was scrubbing walls until my fingers burned raw. He looked up at me uncertain, but I smiled through the sweat and told him this haul was going to change everything. The first weeks were chaos. I carried buckets of paint up and down the ladder, inhaling the sharp scent until my head ached. I cooked canned soup on a hot plate in the back office because we did not have time to go home. At night, when Daniel fell asleep with his pen still in his hand, I would drape my coat across his shoulders before turning back to invoices I barely understood. I had no degree in business, only a determination to never let him see hunger or shame. Our first event was a tiny wedding with rented suits and a sheet cake from the corner bakery. The bride wept tears of joy as she walked down the uneven aisle, and I stood in the shadows thinking that one day Daniel would never feel small again. Every dollar went back into the hall. I drove a car with a cracked windshield, wore the same blouses until the collars frayed, and skipped meals so payroll could be met. By 2005, the banquet hall finally turned a profit. I sat with a loan officer in a Manhattan bank who looked at me like I was playing dress-up asking for money I could never repay. But I signed the papers anyway and walked out with the keys to a second property in Jersey City. Daniel was old enough to help by then. On weekends, he carried trays polished silverware and hauled boxes of linens. He complained like any teenager, but I could see the pride flicker in his eyes when guests mistook him for a staff member. Afterward, we would stop for pizza, and I would tell him that one day he would never have to worry about bills stacked on a kitchen table. The years blurred together in contracts and long nights. In 2008, a storm flooded the Newark Hall water, rising to my waist as chairs floated around me like leaves. Daniel was away at college by then, calling me in panic when he heard what happened. I told him I had it under control, even as I stayed up nights filling out insurance forms begging contractors to work on credit. I could not let him know how close we were to collapse. By 2010, Lawson Hospitality had 3 properties all still carrying debt, but together forming a company. I stood in the lobby of our newest hotel in Midtown, the marble floors gleaming, and felt a surge of triumph. Daniel was there 18 years old, leaning against the wall in a pressed shirt. I told him that every blister on my hands had been worth it to see him standing tall. He grinned and said one day he would make me proud. I believed him. There were nights I wanted to give up. Nights when rejection from investors cut deep, when bankers dismissed me as a woman trying to play in a man's world, when exhaustion pressed so heavy I could barely keep my eyes open. But each time I thought of Daniel's future, the image of him walking confidently into rooms where no one would ever look down on him, and that image carried me through. I remembered pawning my mother's bracelet to cover summer payroll selling the antique dining set, so I could lease office space skipping every vacation because he needed travel programs for school. Each sacrifice etched itself into me. When he asked once why I never came to his fraternity events, I smiled and said I was too busy, though the truth was, I had nothing appropriate to wear and no energy left after 18-hour days. I watched photos online of him laughing with friends and told myself it was enough. The company survived downturns, hurricanes, endless inspections. We opened a conference center in Brooklyn, a resort in upstate New York. I was featured in a small trade magazine, my picture tucked between men half my age. They called me the quiet builder of a hospitality group. They had no idea how many nights I cried into the silence, how many times I whispered prayers that Daniel would never know the humiliation I had endured. Through it all, I kept moving. Each building, each loan, each sleepless night was another brick in the foundation I laid for him. When I looked at the skyline outside my office now, I did not just see towers of glass. I saw years of sacrifice, pieces of jewelry, lost meals, skipped lines etched into my face, all transformed into something permanent. And I saw Daniel, too younger, sweaty from hauling chairs at the Jersey City Hall, pausing to wipe his forehead with the back of his hand. He turned to me half joking, half serious, and said one day he would make me proud. That image came back to me now with an ache so sharp it nearly buckled my knees. I pressed my palm against the desk, steadying myself. The memory of his words lingered like a promise suspended in the air. For years it had fueled me, kept me going when everything else screamed to stop. I wanted to believe it still meant something. The city pulsed outside, the window lights flickering as dusk began to fall. I exhaled slowly, letting the memories settle back into silence. The insult I had just heard still cut deep, but against the backdrop of everything I had endured, it also reminded me of the distance I had traveled. I stood by the glass watching as the river darkened and the towers lit one by one. My reflection looked back at me, older now, but unbroken. Daniel had once promised he would make me proud. The question that gnawed at me was whether he even remembered saying it. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the city fill me, bracing for what would come next. When Daniel left for NYU, the house felt suddenly hollow, the silence pressing in like a weight I could not lift. I had poured every ounce of myself into getting him there, working double shifts, refinancing properties, even skipping payroll for myself so his tuition check would clear on time. He called me during his first week to thank me in a quick, distracted voice before rushing off to join friends, and I told myself that was enough. I wanted him to live the life I had once only dreamed of, surrounded by opportunities instead of survival. As the semesters passed, our conversations grew shorter. I asked about his classes and internships he answered with half sentences. I offered to send extra money for books he accepted without hesitation, but with no more than a clipped thank you. I tried to visit him on campus once, bringing sandwiches from the deli near our old neighborhood, but he waved me off at the library steps, embarrassed by the car I drove and the plain jacket I wore. I told myself he was busy, that it was normal for a young man to pull away. Still, when I drove home alone through the city streets that night, the ache in my chest felt like a door slowly closing. Years later, when he graduated and secured his first job at a financial firm, I was the one who arranged the internship that had opened the door for him. I stayed late at the office reviewing contracts while he shook hands in Midtown bars, climbing a ladder I had built under his feet. I told myself that was what mothers did. I did not realize how quickly gratitude could turn into distance. I first met Olivia at a dinner Daniel insisted on hosting to celebrate a promotion. We met at a trendy restaurant on the Lower East Side where the lighting was low and the waiters spoke in hushed tones. Olivia arrived in a silk dress that shimmered under the dim light, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup impeccable. She greeted me with a smile that never reached her eyes. I noticed immediately the way her gaze traveled down my plain navy blouse, pausing at my worn leather bag, her lips curving in a way that felt more like assessment than welcome. Throughout dinner, she carried the conversation with stories of her blog, her collaborations with bridal designers, her thousands of followers online who adored her curated taste. Daniel laughed at her jokes, leaned in to refill her wine glass, his attention fixed on her every word. When I tried to ask about his work, he answered distractedly before turning back to her. I sat quietly cutting my food into small pieces, forcing myself to swallow despite the knot in my throat. At one point, Olivia leaned back in her chair, tilted her head as if considering me, and said lightly that my style was charmingly old-fashioned. The words were wrapped in sugar but sharp underneath. I caught Daniel's eyes waiting for him to protest or laugh it off, but he lowered his gaze to his plate and said nothing. The rest of the meal blurred. I heard the clink of glasses, the hum of conversation from other tables, the distant beat of music from the street outside. I smiled when required, nodded at Olivia's endless stories, but inside something tightened. When we parted ways at the end of the night, Daniel kissed my cheek quickly, already turning to hold Olivia's hand as they walked away into the city lights. I stood on the sidewalk watching them disappear, the cool air biting against my skin. I tried again on another evening, inviting them both to my apartment in Queens. I cooked roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, Daniel's favorite meal from when he was a boy. Olivia walked through the door with the faint scent of expensive perfume trailing behind her, her eyes sweeping across the modest furniture and the old framed photos on the walls. She smiled politely, but the curve of her lips told me she was cataloging every detail. During dinner, she asked casual questions about the early days of Lawson hospitality, her tone curious, but edged with disbelief, as if she could not imagine me lifting paint buckets or hauling boxes myself. When I explained how I pawned jewelry to cover payroll, she nodded with a faint smile and said that must have been difficult before turning the conversation back to her upcoming photo shoot. Daniel sat silently through it all, chewing, slowly sipping his drink, never once defending me or shifting the subject to ease the sting. I watched him waiting, but the words never came. When Olivia finally leaned back in her chair, her eyes bright with amusement, she said almost sweetly that I looked tired. Perhaps I should rest more. The words landed harder than she could have known. I forced a smile, cleared the dishes, and excused myself to the kitchen. Behind the closed door, I gripped the counter, staring at the faded tile, my breath uneven. I could hear their laughter drifting from the table. My own son laughed along with her while my sacrifices were dismissed as quaint, my presence reduced to fatigue and outdated style. That night after they left, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the empty plates. I thought of Daniel as a boy, his promise to make me proud. I thought of the nights I stayed awake until dawn, calculating numbers on scrap paper to keep the lights on. The silence of the apartment pressed in heavy. Somewhere deep inside me, another silence stirred, older and more painful, the silence of a daughter I had once lost. Her face came back to me in fragments, the infant I never held long enough, the hospital bracelet I kept hidden away, the unanswered questions that followed me through the years. The thought of her lingered in that lonely kitchen, the ache of absence layered on top of fresh wounds. I poured myself a glass of water, hands trembling as I raised it. The reflection in the window stared back, a woman who had built an empire, yet felt invisible at her own table. I whispered into the quiet that I would not let this be the end, but the words faded quickly. I closed my eyes and held on to the memory of Daniel's teenage voice, promising me pride, clinging to it like a lifeline, even as the distance between us widened with every breath. I arrived at the Midtown office early the next morning, trying to drown myself in routine. Reports waited on my desk, contracts in neat stacks, the usual flow of papers that represented progress. Yet the silence in my chest would not leave. Near noon, an assistant rolled in a cart with updated vendor packets from Elegant Events. I signed through the first few pages until my eye caught a planning note highlighted with a small yellow tab. In neat font, a margin line read, "Exclude Maggie Lawson, not the image we want." I froze. My name reduced to a problem to be erased. I held the paper until the edges creased beneath my fingers. It was Olivia's sentiment typed through someone else's hands. I whispered the words again, "Not the image we want," and for a moment it felt as if the years I had carved into this city had been wiped clean with one dismissive stroke. I slid the file into my bag, unable to shake the sharpness of that judgment. That evening, I called Daniel and asked him to come for dinner. I told him it had been too long since we had eaten together, just us. He agreed, though his tone carried the distracted air of someone with obligations elsewhere. I roasted vegetables, cooked the pasta he loved in high school, and set the table in my queen's apartment with the same plates we had used when he was a boy. I wanted him to remember where he came from, to taste the comfort of simpler nights. He arrived an hour late, still in his dark gray suit tie, loosened phone in his hand. He kissed my cheek distractedly, eyes already scanning the glowing screen, and sat down with a sigh. I poured water into his glass and asked about his day. He gave me a short answer, already lifting his fork. I waited until he had taken a few bites before sliding the page across the table. He glanced at it, brow furrowing, then pushed it back without lifting his eyes. I asked him if Olivia had written those words, if he truly agreed that I was not the image they wanted. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, leaned back in his chair, and said Olivia simply wanted a wedding that matched her vision. He told me not to take it personally. I felt my chest tighten. I asked if he remembered the Newark Hall, the mildew walls I scrubbed while he did homework on a folding chair, the nights I pawned jewelry to keep payroll alive, the hurricane that left me waist-deep in water-saving chairs. He nodded faintly but said nothing. I pressed further, asking if he remembered telling me that one day he would make me proud. He shifted uncomfortably, then repeated that Olivia had high standards and that appearances mattered. The silence thickened between us. I could hear the faint hum of traffic outside the window. I told him I had sacrificed everything so he would never know shame that I had built Lawson Hospitality, so he could walk into any room with his head held high. He picked at his plate, eyes lowered, offering no defense. I carried dishes to the sink, water running loudly to cover the tremor in my breath. When I returned, he was scrolling his phone again. I asked him gently if he had ever told Olivia the truth of how we built this company, how much of my life was carved into its foundations. He shrugged, said she already knew enough. My heart sank at the indifference. Finally, he checked the time, said Olivia was waiting. He stood, straightened his tie, and thanked me flatly for dinner. I asked him if he really believed I would damage the image of his wedding. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he avoided my eyes. He kissed my cheek quickly like a formality and walked to the door. When it closed, the echo rang through the apartment. I sank into the chair he had just left, staring at the empty plate, the roasted vegetables cooling the glass of water half full. I thought of the boy who once carried chairs beside me and told me he would make me proud. That boy had vanished into a man who could not raise his voice in my defense. I carried the leftover pasta to the refrigerator, slid the container onto a shelf, and stood in the dim light of the kitchen. My eyes stung, but no tears came. Instead, a slow heat built inside, not anger yet, but the beginning of resolve. I walked to the window. The lights of Manhattan glittered in the distance, the skyline sharp against the night. I pressed my palm against the glass and whispered that I would not be erased. They could plan a wedding without me, but they would learn what it meant to dismiss the very foundation beneath their celebration. I returned to the table, folded the elegant events note carefully, and slipped it back into the folder. I placed the folder in my bag and closed the clasp with steady hands. My son had chosen silence over loyalty, Olivia's vision over my presence. The distance between us was no longer a crack. It was a canyon. The night pressed on quietly. I turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the glow from the window. I sat alone in the living room, hands folded in my lap, feeling both hollow and unyielding. The ache of betrayal settled deep, but so did the certainty that I would not let this insult pass without an answer. I leaned back against the worn couch, letting the city noise drift through the thin walls. Somewhere out there, Daniel was sitting beside Olivia, planning a celebration polished for her followers, confident that I would swallow the humiliation in silence. They did not yet understand who I had become in all those years of sacrifice. I closed my eyes and let the memories of labor and survival wash over me, the banquet halls, the contracts, the endless nights of exhaustion. Every wound I carried had been for Daniel's sake. Now each one hardened into something else, something sharper. By the time I stood to prepare for bed, the decision had begun to take shape inside me. It was not yet fully formed, but its outline was clear. If they wished to exclude me from their vision, then I would show them the power of what it meant to be truly excluded. I turned off the lamp, carried my bag to the bedroom, and placed it carefully on the chair by the dresser. The folder inside held the note that had tried to erase me. Soon enough, I would decide how to answer it. For now, I lay down, closed my eyes, and let the hum of the city carry me into a restless sleep. The following morning, I sat at the head of the Lawson Hospitality boardroom table, a polished stretch of mahogany that had carried countless decisions. My executives gathered in their usual places, papers stacked neatly before them, the sound of shuffling pages filling the silence until David Chen cleared his throat. He stood with his binder open, glasses perched low on his nose, his voice steady as he delivered the latest financial review of the Lawson Moore wedding. The projected cost, he said, had reached $300,000. $200,000 had already been placed as deposit through our accounts. He turned a page and began listing the commitments. A luxury block of rooms in our Midtown hotel reserved for over 100 guests. Catering from our flagship division with custom menus requiring imported ingredients. A fleet of black limousines scheduled for the bridal party. A high-end photographer who had cleared his calendar for rehearsals and the main event. Florals arriving from Connecticut. Lighting and audio staff on retainer. Each service already halfway executed, each tied to our brand. The numbers glowed on the projection screen behind him, columns of figures stacked higher than the debt I once feared would drown me. I folded my hands on the table, listening as if from a distance. My money, my company, my life's work had been poured into a day where my name was not even whispered, a day where my presence had been labeled a stain. One of the directors asked if the deposits could be reduced. David replied that cancellation clauses protected only partial recovery. Another asked about contingency planning in case of overages. David answered calmly, explaining that additional funds might be required if Olivia demanded last-minute changes, which, judging by her pattern, was almost guaranteed. I sat silent, feeling every eye slide toward me, waiting for a reaction. I kept my face composed. My gaze lingered on the spreadsheet, the bold numbers at the bottom. I saw not only money, but nights spent dragging paint buckets across cracked floors, bracelets pawned, vacations never taken, meals, skipped, all of it transfigured into a line item for a celebration I was forbidden to attend. I lifted my eyes to David. He paused, sensing the shift. He asked if I had any adjustments to recommend. My fingers pressed against the wood, steady now. For years, I had taught myself to breathe through humiliation, to keep walking when doors shut in my face, to carry burdens silently. But this silence tasted different. This silence felt like surrender. The directors murmured as David moved to the next slide, but I no longer heard the details. I saw only Olivia's carefully staged photos, Daniel's proud smile beside her, and my own absence carved into the guest list. My son had let another voice rewrite my role in his life, and I was paying for the ink on that script. The pen in my hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the gathering of something sharp. I tapped it once against the paper, a sound small, but distinct enough to quiet the room. Heads turned. I leaned back slowly, forcing calm into my voice as I asked David to leave the breakdown on my desk when the meeting ended. He nodded, his expression unreadable, but his eyes lingered on me with a trace of concern. The meeting continued with updates on other properties' revenue forecasts, staffing changes. I spoke when required, my tone even, but the numbers from the wedding remained etched in my vision. $300,000, $200,000 already sunk. A banquet prepared for strangers, while the mother who paid the bills was erased. When the meeting closed, the directors filed out one by one. Some offered polite smiles, others avoided my gaze. David stayed behind, gathering his notes. He paused as if wanting to say something more, then simply placed the binder in front of him. He whispered that he would support whatever decision he made. I inclined my head, not trusting my voice. Alone in the room, I flipped through the binder again. The glossy photos of floral arrangements stared back at me, beautiful and expensive, each stem a reminder of my exclusion. I closed the folder sharply. The echo filled the boardroom like a gavel. I walked to the window, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The city pulsed with energy, indifferent to one woman's humiliation. Yet I knew that everything I had built stood because I had refused to bow to dismissal. Now the dismissal came not from bankers or competitors, but from my own blood. I rested both hands on the glass. My reflection wavered against the tower's silver hair at my temples, eyes shadowed, but clear. They had called me trash, erased me from their vision, spent my money while denying me a chair. My silence had allowed it to reach this point, and I understood then with a clarity that steadied my breath. Silence was no longer strength. Silence was consent. If I remained quiet, I would become exactly what they named me. I turned back to the table, picked up the binder, and tucked it under my arm. The hum of the city rose faintly through the windows as I walked toward the door. My heels clicked against the polished floor, each step heavier but sharper, carrying me toward a choice that had already begun to take shape. In the hallway, the staff moved briskly, unaware of the storm gathering in the woman passing them by. I carried the binder to my office, set it on the desk, and opened it once more. The pages glared up at me with their confident certainty, their unchecked extravagance. My fingers traced the margin where my name had been removed from sight. I closed the book again and sat back, breathing deeply, feeling the ache harden into resolve. My son had chosen to stay silent. I would not. The sun had dipped low by the time I rose from my chair. The office lights flickered on automatically, bathing the room in artificial brightness. I gathered my papers into neat piles, placed the binder at the center, and let my hand rest there a moment. The stillness settled around me, heavy but sure. I understood fully now that each insult endured without response became a foundation for the next. I had endured enough. This silence would be my last. The next morning I walked into the boardroom with a steadiness I had not felt in weeks. The long glass windows spilled sunlight across the table where my executives were already seated, stacks of paper neatly aligned laptops open. David Chen stood near the screen at the end of the room waiting for my signal. I gave a nod and he began. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed as he reviewed the Lawson Moore wedding once again. He spoke of venue layouts, catering contracts, transportation schedules, guest accommodations. Each figure clicked onto the screen a parade of costs I had already memorized. I watched the numbers rise like a wall designed to shut me out. My hands rested flat against the table. I let his report play out without interruption. The boardroom hushed except for his voice and the faint hum of the projector. The directors scribbled notes, some stealing glances at me, unsure how I might react after the last meeting's silence. The image of that line in Elegant Events notes burned in my mind. Exclude Maggie Lawson, not the image we want. I heard it with every dollar listed, every floral arrangement, and imported bottle of champagne. David paused, closing his binder, waiting for approval. I tapped my pen once against the wood, the small sound cutting through the quiet. All eyes turned toward me. I felt the weight of their anticipation, and for the first time in a long time, I did not flinch. Process cancellation. The words left my lips evenly, almost casually, but the force behind them was undeniable. David blinked, adjusting his glasses. He asked me to confirm. I repeated it. Cancel all services Lawson is providing for this event. Venue, hotel, catering, limousine, lighting, sound. Effective immediately. The room froze. One of the directors shifted in his chair. Another opened her mouth to speak, then thought better of it. I continued, my tone calm but firm. As the payer of record, I am exercising our right under the liquidated damages clause. Every contract signed under Lawson Hospitality contains termination protection. The deposits will remain with us. All other amounts will be refunded according to policy. The silence thickened for a moment longer, then David gave a single nod. Understood. He turned to his team, gesturing quickly. Assistants rose from their chairs, phones already in hand, laptops snapping shut as they moved with urgency. The machinery of the company I had built began shifting direction, precise and immediate. I opened my own laptop, pulled up the draft cancellation template I had quietly prepared the night before. My fingers moved with certainty as I typed the subject line. Cancellation. The body was only a few sentences long. Effective immediately, terminate all services provided by Lawson Hospitality for the Lawson Moore wedding. Refund all payments made by guests and family with the exception of deposits. Notify all vendors without delay. I read it once, then pressed send. The hum began almost instantly. Calls went out to the hotel, to catering, to transportation. The florist's office phone rang, and a manager set down her shears mid-stem, frowning at the abrupt notice. At the limousine garage, schedules were pulled from drivers' hands, replaced with revised assignments. In Midtown, our reservations team received the order to release the hotel block, freeing 100 rooms back to the open market. Each call was a domino tipping into the next, the collapse unfolding in real time. I sat still, hands folded, watching the flurry of movement. There was no need to raise my voice. Power did not shout. Power moved quietly, efficiently, until no one could deny its reach. The directors shifted uneasily, but none challenged me. They knew the contracts were airtight, that the law was on my side. Within minutes, confirmation emails began to arrive. Cancellations processed, vendors notified, refunds scheduled. The numbers on the screen updated one by one. Where once there had been a celebration in motion, there was now a ledger of terminated obligations. $200,000 in deposits remained firmly in Lawson accounts, untouchable, the price of exclusion. The boardroom door opened and my assistant stepped in, her face pale. She whispered that Caitlin from Elegant Events was on the line. She sounded frantic. I told her not to put the call through. The realization would reach Caitlin soon enough, as each notice landed in her inbox, each stamped with our seal. I stood smoothing the lapel of my jacket and walked to the window. The skyline shimmered in the midday sun-glass towers, reflecting light like shards. Below, the city carried on, unaware that a wedding once valued at $300,000 had just vanished with a single command. Somewhere Olivia was likely staring at her phone in disbelief. Somewhere Daniel would soon feel the ground give way beneath him. The phone on the table buzzed his name, flashing across the screen. I let it ring. His anger could wait. What mattered now was the stillness settling over me, the clarity that comes when a boundary is finally drawn. I pressed my fingertips lightly to the glass, the surface cool against my skin. For years I had allowed silence to protect me, believing endurance alone would carry me through. But silence had become agreement. With one order, I had broken it. The wedding was no longer theirs to flaunt or mine to endure. It was gone. Behind me, David approached quietly. "All cancellations are confirmed," he said. "Vendors have acknowledged receipt. Guests will see refunds by the end of the week. Deposits remain secure." I nodded, my voice steady as I thanked him. His eyes lingered a moment, a flicker of respect passing through them, then he stepped back to give me space. The city roared beyond the glass horns, voices, sirens, all the noise of life continuing. Inside the boardroom, a calm settled, heavy but unshakable. I had been labeled trash, excluded from their vision, but it was my signature that determined whether the vision existed at all. And with a single line, a single click, it no longer did. I turned from the window and gathered my papers, sliding them into my bag. The directors sat in silence, watching. I met their eyes briefly before walking toward the door. There was nothing left to explain. My decision had been made, and the collapse was already echoing far beyond these walls. The elevator doors closed around me, sealing the boardroom from view. I exhaled slowly, the weight in my chest shifting, no longer raw, but resolved. For the first time in months, my silence felt like choice, not defeat. What came next would not be easy, but it would be mine to command. The first signs arrived as soft chimes from my laptop subject lines, stacking in tidy rows, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. Catering confirmed that all specialty prep had ceased, and purchase orders were voided before shipment. A second message logged that seafood and produce had been turned around at the warehouse. The pastry kitchen reported that sugar work would be melted down for staff meals, and that custom molds were returned to storage. Each line felt like a door clicking shut in a long hallway. Dispatch in Long Island City sent a brief update that drivers had been pulled from the wedding route and folded into airport service and corporate pickups. The board that once showed a neat procession of bridal party times and hotel loops had been wiped clean. I pictured a chauffeur setting his cap on a shelf and sliding behind the wheel for an ordinary run, the relief quiet and private. Midtown reservations followed with a calm report that the room block was released back to inventory. Minutes later, Another note described the first guests at the marble counter with garment bags and careful hair faces moving from confusion to worry as the manager explained that the event had been canceled by the payer of record and refunds were in motion. Hospitality is a discipline of steady voices and unwavering posture. Our staff did what they were trained to do. They offered bottled water. They printed refund acknowledgments. They did not speculate. A florist north of the city wrote that pallets of peonies and ranunculus would be rerouted to another gala, and that the arch design could be repurposed by weekend. Beauty is resilient when pressed by reality. A photographer texted to ask if there was any chance of reversal and held his crew at a coffee shop for an hour before sending everyone home. A hairstylist unrolled brushes in a suite across town and packed them again with the same care. A celebration is a web of independent threads. Remove the anchor point and the silk sags in the air. By early afternoon, the human ripple reached my desk. A cousin in a navy suit filmed himself outside our lobby saying he had traded shifts at the warehouse to be here voice caught between pride and embarrassment. A friend of the bride posted a photo of sequins and a carry-on and wrote that it was her first time in New York and she would try to see the lights anyway. Comments appeared from strangers with deli suggestions and subway tips. The city can make room for people when a plan falls through. Then a short hallway video surfaced in a private forum and spilled into public spaces. The frame shook, but the audio was clear. Olivia spoke about image and perfection and the need to remove what did not fit. At the end, she used the word trash. It landed with a cold accuracy that did not require explanation. The clip did not need my help to travel. Within minutes, it was on a popular Reddit thread, and then threaded through TikTok with captions and stitches. A woman in her 50s said softly that the deepest cuts come from people who should love you. A young man in a work shirt explained liquidated damages with a whiteboard and a marker. A planner with tired eyes detailed how quickly an event collapses when a primary provider exits. The tone was not a roar, but a collective intake of breath. Caitlin from Elegant Events called my assistant, then called again. My assistant stood in my doorway and asked if I wished to take the call. I said not today. The answer already sat in every inbox, stamped with our seal. There is a point where conversation becomes a performance meant to rearrange blame. I was finished with performances. The next name that filled my screen was Daniel. I watched it glow and fade. He tried again. The device buzzed against the wood and then went still. I turned the volume off and let the room settle into a quiet I had earned. Reports from the hotel grew more vivid as rehearsal hour approached. Small groups formed under the chandelier, people checking messages and trading rumors. A groomsman insisted the desk had made an error. A relative begged for any ballroom, any time, any compromise that would save the weekend. Security remained patient. Our team walked guests through refunds and stood with them while they rebooked flights. Dignity matters when pride lies open on a public counter. Vendors beyond our control clung to their assignments a little longer. The photographer waited on the curb with a bag of lenses, watching sliding doors that did not open. A band tuned quietly in a rehearsal studio and then packed up in a practiced silence. The tuxedo shop sent a reminder about returns. No one had done anything wrong. The machinery had simply stopped. Another video reached my feed as evening turned the avenue lavender. Someone filmed from the far end of a corridor while staff stacked unused chairs and rolled a bar cart away. The camera drifted to Daniel and Olivia near a pair of gilded doors. He stared at his screen, jaw tight, as if a different outcome could be summoned by force of will. She smoothed a stray strand and looked at her reflection in the darkened glass, assessing not the truth, but the angle. For a single breath, she looked very young. Then the surface settled over her again. My assistant stepped in and asked quietly if I needed anything. I told her I would take no calls for the next hour. She nodded and withdrew, closing the door with the care of someone who understands that silence can be part of leadership. I stood at the window and watched headlights stitch white lines between crosswalks. Two guests in formal wear turned the corner toward a deli, the woman balancing heels in one hand, the man carrying a tux jacket over his arm. They would fly home with stories that would grow smaller over time, told with a shrug at barbecues and office kitchens. Those closest to the center would not forget so easily. My phone pulsed once more with messages I did not read. Somewhere across town, Olivia was learning how quickly a brand can tilt when a single word reveals its spine. Somewhere, Daniel was encountering a boundary that did not move when he pushed. I felt no euphoria, only alignment. I had used the tools I built to protect the company that fed us all. The law held. The notices were clean. The world rarely balances the ledger, but sometimes it allows a precise correction. Night deepened, and the lobby reset for a corporate banquet. Staff lifted tablecloths from rolling racks, clipped floor plans to carts, and carried on with the kind of grace that keeps a hotel alive. I shut my laptop and let the dark hold the room. The last clip I had seen lingered for a moment in my mind. Daniel and Olivia stood in their corridor with bouquets meant for someone else leaning in buckets nearby, surrounded by half-finished beauty and a silence they had once demanded from me. I gathered my bag and paused with my hand on the back of the chair. The city moved under the windows, relentless and indifferent. The damage to their plans had already spread through their circle. The real work of consequence would arrive in the days that followed. For now, the cascade had reached its endpoint. The block was released, the vans were turned, the staff had gone home. I turned off the light and stepped into the hallway. The elevator doors closed and the car began to descend. In the mirrored panel, I met my own gaze, steady and unshaken. Outside, the night air felt cool and exact against my face. I stood for a breath on the sidewalk and then started forward, ready to meet whatever call would come next. My phone rang so hard it slid against the wood of my desk. I answered, and Daniel spilled anger into my ear, words tumbling over each other about humiliation and blame and how I would undo this now. I listened without speaking. When he paused for breath, I ended the call. A moment later, I sent a message with a time and a place. Harbor View Resort Atrium Lounge, noon. There was nothing else to discuss over a line that only carried heat. The next day, the Hudson looked like a sheet of gray steel under a low sky. Harbor View's lobby smelled of lemon polish and fresh coffee. I chose a corner table where I could see the entrance and the river through the wall of glass. Staff moved with hotel quiet, smoothing linen, setting water, lifting chairs with practiced hands. At noon, Daniel pushed through the doors too fast, shoulders high, jaw tight. Olivia followed with large sunglasses despite the indoor light. Richard came behind them at a slower pace, hands in his coat pockets like a man late to a scene he already regretted. Daniel reached the table and leaned toward me, voice low but shaking. He said I had humiliated him in front of colleagues, that partners were forwarding videos, that the hotel had lied, that I was cruel for using the company against him. He said the pressure had been unbearable and that I, of all people, should understand. I asked him to sit. He resisted for a beat and then dropped into the chair, metal legs scraping. Olivia slid beside him and removed her sunglasses, blinking hard. Richard took the chair across from me and studied his hands. I told Daniel that Lawson Hospitality had terminated services under a clause he had filed himself as a teenager when he needed extra cash and helped in our office. Deposits remained with us. Refunds were in motion. Vendors had acknowledged receipt. Every step taken was within policy and law. He said it was his wedding and I had no right. I said the event ceased to be his the moment he placed its weight on my books and erased me from its frame. Olivia's breathing changed. She said image mattered, that their followers expected a certain standard that family can complicate a clean brand. She said a hallway clip had been stripped of context and that she had been exhausted and careless. I asked what word she meant. She swallowed and said she had called me trash. The word landed between us with the same sharp edge I had already heard online, and for a second she seemed smaller inside it. Richard cleared his throat. Time had thinned his hair and softened the blue of his eyes. He said he had heard enough comments to know something was wrong and chose to stay silent, telling himself he no longer had standing to intervene. He said he had confused neutrality with virtue when it was only fear. The admission shook once in his voice and then steadied. He said he was sorry. Truth can arrive late and still be truth. It does not change the clock. Daniel leaned forward with his palms up as if he could catch the argument before it shattered. He said he would post a statement by evening, that he would insist I had approved everything, and that a junior manager had misread a memo that the company had made an honest error. He said people wanted a happy ending and would accept one if we gave it to them. He sounded like a boy promising to reassemble glass with wishes. I let the silence lengthen until his words ran out. Then I told him that no statement would attach my name to his story again. I reached into my bag and placed a slim folder on the table. Weeks ago, I had asked counsel to draft a structured transfer of 20% of Lawson Hospitality to him, a stake valued near $35 million under our last appraisal. His eyes lifted, then brightened with a hope he could not hide. I slid the top page toward me again and held it. Paper tears quietly when you commit to the motion. I tore the signature page once, clean and straight. I tore the next page, then the next, until a small scatter of white lay on the dark wood like a dusting of snow. Olivia made a sound and pressed her fingers to her lips. Daniel stared at the pieces as if they might drift back together if he stared hard enough. Richard closed his eyes. I said no transfer had been executed, no filing made, no board vote taken. What existed was intention, and intention had died the moment that word left Olivia's mouth, while my son stood nearby and let it live. Our attorneys would memorialize my withdrawal in writing by the end of the week. Succession planning would proceed without him. The pages on the table were not law. They were a mirror. I needed him to see himself in it before I put it away. He said I was punishing him for a single mistake. I said the mistake was not the word. It was the posture he had chosen, the math he had done in his head, without speaking, where my presence weighed as a liability to his image rather than the ground under his feet. One syllable had revealed a long calculation. Olivia reached a little across the table and stopped. She said she would apologize publicly without makeup, that she would donate to a fund for women in business, that she would do a series about humility and accountability. The cadence sounded like a crisis kit she had learned in a studio with good lighting. I said consequences are not content. Her hand retreated. She nodded without speaking. Richard spoke again, softer than before. He said that a man who will not defend his mother when she is plainly wronged will not win the long trust of any partner who is watching. Daniel's jaw flexed and then relaxed. Anger flashed and cooled like heat lightning. He said I had chosen strangers over my own family. I said I had chosen standards that existed before he could lift a tray in our first hall. The lobby choreography continued around us. A bell cart rolled past. Glassware chimed faintly from the bar. The river moved with slow certainty toward the harbor. I gathered the torn pieces into the folder and slid it into my bag. A few shreds clung to my fingers. I brushed them away and let them settle on the tile like confetti from a party that would never happen. I stood and told them the meeting was over. I told Daniel I hoped he would build a life that did not depend on trimming away the people who made his first steps possible. I told Olivia that the apology she owes me is not a video and not a caption. I told Richard that I heard his words and that their truth did not erase their lateness. None of them replied. Daniel's chair scraped the floor. Olivia glanced once more at her reflection in the glass. Richard lifted his chin as if to test the weight of his own spine and found it intact. I walked toward the wall of windows and paused with my palm against the cool surface. My reflection met me, a woman older now, steady, no longer confusing silence with strength. Outside, a ferry cut a white seam across the gray water and closed it behind with no effort at all. I let my hand fall and crossed the lobby toward the revolving doors. The air on the sidewalk felt clean against my face. Cars moved, voices rose and fell, life kept its pace. I stood for a breath and then began to walk the decision quiet and solid in my chest, the sound of paper tearing still crisp in memory, even as the folder rested closed at my side. Morning arrived with a sheet of headlines climbing my phone before the kettle had finished heating. The same shape appeared again and again that a $300,000 wedding had disappeared with a single order. Some led with the number as if it were a drum beat. Others put my title near the top as if it were a warning. I set the phone face down on the counter and breathed in the quiet of the kitchen, the soft hiss of the radiator, the faint city hum through the window. Then I turned the screen over and began to read. A morning show segment talked through contracts and boundaries in measured voices. A lawyer in a plain office explained liquidated damages without theater, and for once, an audience wanted the details. On an event forum, a planner with tape on her fingers traced a floor plan and walked viewers through how a large wedding fails when the primary provider exits. She did not sound gleeful. She sounded relieved to tell the truth plainly. David had already routed press inquiries into a folder with a single line that Lawson Hospitality does not comment on private events and enforces its agreements as written. He added a note that vendors were calm by midday and that the Midtown lobby had been reset by night for a corporate banquet. Managers from properties I opened long ago sent brief messages saying they were proud of the boundary we held. I thanked them in the same short tone. Recognition does not require fireworks. By late morning, a thread on a large community site had climbed high, where strangers weigh behavior like jurors. Near the top, someone wrote that you do not cross the mother who built the room you are standing in. It read like an old proverb carried without a source. The hallway clip appeared again, and the single word I already knew cut through the comments like a clean blade. Replies were fast and sharp, then a calmer voice asked people to let consequence do its work. I set the phone down and let silence move through the room. Emails began to map the cost of image. A cosmetics brand told Olivia's agent that a spring campaign was paused and would not resume. A bridal designer withdrew a collaboration that would have placed her at a runway series. A tableware company canceled a set of sponsored posts and requested return of product. The language was courteous and final. Brand safety appeared more than once. There is mercy in clarity. It saves you from hoping against what is plain. News about Daniel arrived colder and quieter. A recruiter who had called him weekly sent one tidy sentence that they were moving in a different direction. The firm where he had been courting a full-time role wrote that conversion would not be offered at this time. Another headhunter who had once pressed for lunch stopped answering entirely. The professional world does not slam doors when it refuses you. It simply does not open them. A local column mentioned the Parker family store on a tidy street and noted that they had expected out-of-town visitors for a celebration. The piece was not cruel on its face, but by afternoon, a few anonymous reviews had appeared, some petty, some sharp. I set the paper aside and tried not to picture a mother at a glass case straightening a tray while pretending not to see a phone angled her way. Harm travels along routes no one plotted. Our public relations advisor wrote that brevity had served us and recommended we keep it. Crisis invites more words than wisdom. She suggested a single line on our site that Lawson does not discuss private events and that clients are bound by terms they sign. I approved the line and put on my coat. Outside Queens was bright and cold. Bare branches made black lace against a pale sky. In the small park, a woman steadied a toddler near the swings. A man in work boots ate a sandwich on a bench without turning the page of his folded paper. This block did not know my name, and I was grateful. I walked until the tightness behind my ribs loosened. When I came back, the apartment smelled of coffee gone cool. I warmed it again and stood at the window with the cup in my hands. Near midday, the Midtown manager sent a note. 2 guests who had stayed one night after the cancellation checked out early. One left a line at the desk that he would tell the story for years, but would remember most that staff treated him with dignity. The sentence placed a small light in the day. I let it sit where I could see it. Afternoon shows tried to assign a lesson. One framed it as class, another as corporate muscle. None of them had stood with me in a pawn shop in Newark trading a ring for a down payment. None had stood in floodwater lifting chairs to higher ground, with hands that had gone numb. They did not need those images to reach the simple point that a boundary held and that money did not purchase exemption from consequence. A camera cannot lacquer a word that cut so cleanly through the door where love should have stood. Daniel did not call. A text arrived from an unfamiliar number in the tone of a publicist asking for a meeting to shape the narrative. I declined. Olivia posted a caption that tried to name accountability without naming me. The comments split between those who wanted blood and those who asked for grace. I added nothing to either side. Bookings did not drop. David called at dusk to say inquiries for corporate galas had ticked up by 2, and that a planner who had once kept us at a distance had asked for a site tour. She had told him quietly that she admired how cleanly we had handled the week. I told him to go home. He said after one last email. I told him to write it in the elevator. I ate soup standing at the counter not because it was good, but because warmth takes its own kind of courage from a bowl. The radiator clicked. A siren rose and fell outside. I sat in the half-light and scrolled once more through headlines and then stopped. I was not searching for a verdict. I was teaching my hands to put the device down. A small essay drifted to the top of a news app and carried a single line that stayed with me. Power is not a shout. Power is a boundary you hold without applause. I did not save it. I let the words live for a while in the quiet room and then fade back into the air. Later, an email from accounting confirmed what the spreadsheets already implied, that deposits remained in our accounts, that refunds had posted that no exceptions had been granted and none would be. Numbers can be cold. They can also be clean. I closed the message and ran a fingertip along the edge of the table until my breath steadied. After dark, I stood at the window and watched the river carry a long ribbon of reflection south. Towers blinked awake, one square at a time, until the skyline looked like a field of careful stars. My phone buzzed once with a number I did not know and then went silent. Somewhere Daniel was encountering a boundary that did not move when he pushed. Somewhere Olivia was learning how quickly a brand tilts when one word reveals the spine under the gloss. Somewhere the Parkers were closing their shop with hands that shook and faces they held still for customers. I wished all of them the clarity I had been forced to find. I felt no triumph. Justice did not feel like thunder. It felt like a scale nudged closer to level by a steady hand. It felt like the air in a room after a door that should have been closed is finally shut. I turned off the kitchen light and let the apartment rest in the soft gray that comes before night settles. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap, letting the quiet widen until it reached the corners, not gloating, not planning lines for anyone, only acknowledging that for once, consequence had chosen the correct address. The office carried a calm I had not felt in days. I set my bag on the credenza, clicked on the small lamp, and watched pale light settle over the stack of folders on my desk. Beyond the glass, the city gathered itself into another morning taxi, sliding along the avenue, the river a narrow band of pewter. David had cleared my inbox of noise. For one long breath, the room felt like a room again and not a battlefield. A soft knock. My assistant stepped in and said there was a young woman asking for me by name. She added that the visitor had no appointment and was holding white daisies. I told her to send the woman in. The bouquet arrived first, wrapped in plain paper stems, still damp. Then the face I had never seen and somehow knew. The way her eyes scanned the office as if bracing for a small sorrow and then steadied. The line of her jaw that matched mine when I am trying not to show fatigue. She paused at the threshold as if the doorway were both trial and beginning. She said her name was Elena Torres. She said she teaches English at a public high school in Brooklyn. She glanced at the flowers and said she hoped daisies were right for morning. I told her they were perfect. She crossed the carpet, set the bouquet on the round table by the window, and turned back to me. She said one word. "Mom." The sound was soft and exact, as if a key had been placed gently on my desk. The room tipped and righted itself. I steadied my hand on the chair back. Before I could answer, my phone began to vibrate across the room. Daniel's name flashed hard. Elena raised her palm slightly, a question without words. I let my hand fall. She answered and pressed the speaker. Daniel's voice poured into the office, already at a boil. He said I had ruined his career, that partners were retreating, that I would undo everything now. Elena kept her eyes on mine. She spoke with the measured cadence of a teacher who can quiet a crowded hallway without raising her voice. She said he was speaking to Elena Torres. She said Margaret was not available to be shouted at. She said that if he wanted to discuss business, he could contact counsel, and if he wanted to discuss family, he would need to address our mother with respect. He demanded to know who she thought she was. She said she was the daughter who had found her mother. Then she ended the call and set the phone face down. Silence settled like cool water. A breath left me that I did not know I was holding. Elena gave a small half shrug, the kind you make when you have chosen calm over spectacle. She said she had not planned to do that, but that sometimes a boundary needs a voice. I reached for the bouquet and touched a petal. It was dewy and a little bruised proof of a trip across the city. Real. Here. Words came slow, and then they came. I told her there is a hospital bracelet tucked in a box and a letter I once wrote and never sent because I had nowhere to send it. I told her about nights when quiet felt like a weight on my chest and days when work filled the hours until the edges blurred. I told her about the ache of a name without a face. Elena listened with her hands flat on her knees, eyes steady as if she knew where to place the weight without dropping it. She said her mother had been stubborn and generous in a small apartment in Sunset Park, that love was plentiful even when money was not. She said that when she turned 18, her mother told her there might be another woman in the world who had once carried her name and that Elena could choose to search or to let time close the door. She chose to wait. Then a hallway video reached her phone, and the waiting changed from care to forgetting herself. We sat at the round table. I poured water into 2 glasses. She smiled at the bouquet and said her students insist daisies mean beginnings. The florist had laughed and said meanings are messy, but sometimes teenagers get to be right. She told me she had been grading essays on the subway when a colleague sent a link with my face beneath a headline and asked if I looked familiar. She closed her classroom door, took out the old letter, and promised she would not choose another day of not choosing. I told her she could have walked into this office on any morning, and I would have opened the door. The certainty of the sentence surprised me, and then it did not. She nodded and said she believed that before she arrived, which is why she brought flowers instead of a plan. I asked about her students. She said they are loud and brilliant and tired at the same time that one girl writes like rain, and that a boy who rarely speaks draws faces with a number 2 pencil that look back as if they have thoughts of their own. Teaching, she said, is like building a bridge out of thread that holds better than anyone expects until they cross and discover they are safe. A barge slid along the river beyond the glass. I told her about the banquet hall in Newark and the flood that climbed past my waist about counting payroll with a pencil stub, about a teenage boy who once promised to make me proud, and how the light of that promise dimmed so slowly I failed to notice the room had gone dark. Elena looked at the daisies and at me and said we could make our own light now. She said it plainly. The words felt like a floor under my feet. The phone buzzed once with an unknown number. I let it pass. Elena asked if I wanted her to screen calls for an hour. The offer carried a simple caretaking I had not known in years. I said David could keep the clocks running. For now, I wanted to know what tea she drinks and whether she has seen the view from the roof of our Midtown hotel. Peppermint, she said, and once on a school tour when she pressed her cheek to the glass and did not care about smudges. I said the best smudges are the ones left by awe, and she laughed and the room brightened. The tears came without staging. They slid sure and quiet. Elena stood, came around the table, and rested her hands on my shoulders, light but firm. She said we could cry and still stand after. I let years unspool. For the bracelet in a box. For the letter unsent. For a hallway word, and a son who left the defense of his mother to strangers on a screen. For the woman I had to become to live to this hour. When the tremor eased, she crossed to the credenza, found the small box of tissues, and handed me one like she had known where it was all along. We spoke then the way families do when a door that should always have been open finally swings on its hinge. I asked if there was anyone I should call to say she was safe. She said she had told a friend at school she was meeting someone important and would check in at lunch. We typed a short message together. She described an apartment with a couch that lists to one side because of a stubborn spring and a view of a water tower that turns copper at dusk. She said we could have pasta there one night if I did not mind bowls that do not match. I said, mismatched bowls are proof that a life is being lived. A quieter quiet settled, not the kind that follows grief, the kind that follows arrival. The daisies stood bright on the table. I rose and said there is a room upstairs where the city looks like proof that second chances are not a myth. Elena lifted the bouquet and said we should bring them so the space would hold something living that belongs to us. At the door, I touched her wrist so I would not startle her and told her she could choose any name for me that felt safe. She held my gaze and shook her head. She said she had waited long enough to say the small word and intended to keep it. Something inside me loosened and rooted at once. We crossed to the private elevator. The doors closed and the sound of the city thinned. The car rose. Elena carried the flowers in one hand and reached for my fingers with the other, her grip warm and sure. The doors opened to clean light and a wide line of water. We stepped toward the glass together with the daisies between us, ready to look out at a city I had stood over alone for too long, and to decide where we would stand next. I kept the daisies in a glass by the window and moved them each night, so the cleaning crew would not file them away with lobby leftovers. In the evenings, Elena and I rode the train to Queens, the heat clattering through the pipes, a pot set to boil while we watched the avenue slip toward dark. We cooked simple food and ate from bowls that did not match. She told me about her classroom, a girl who finally held an opening sentence in her hands like a found coin, a boy who drew portraits during lunch that looked back as if they had a private thought. I told her pieces I had never said out loud, the Newark hall that smelled of bleach after the flood, the winter I counted payroll on a scrap of paper, and promised myself I would not fail the people who had trusted me. We did not hurry any of it. We let the stories find their own chairs. On Saturday, I brought down an old storage box from the top of the closet and set it on the table. Inside lay the hospital bracelet I had kept like a private relic, a few photos from years that look grainy now, a small ledger where my pencil had worn thin. Elena traced the curve of the bracelet with one finger and set it back with care. She did not ask for explanations. She allowed the room to hold what it needed to hold. Later, we carried groceries up 3 flights the paper bags, cutting our fingers in the familiar way that makes a home feel lived in. The stubborn spring in the couch found her leg again. She laughed, then sat anyway. At the office, the week moved with a steadiness I trusted. The board convened in the glass room high above the avenue while rain tapped the windows. David Chen sat to my right with a binder open. Counsel arranged their folders at the far end of the table. Directors took their seats with the patient precision of people who understand the weight of paper. The resolution sat on the agenda in plain language. Remove Daniel Lawson from the formal line of succession and dissolve the provisional plan that had once imagined him in a future he had not earned. There were no speeches. We spoke about staff and clients and lenders, about the trust that keeps a hospitality company alive. I said the company must mirror the values that built it, or it will not survive me. Doors had been held open for the unprepared long enough in the name of sentiment. When we called the vote, hands rose without noise. The motion carried. Counsel marked the record with a soft finality that sounded like a lock finding its seat. I stood at the window afterward and watched cabs slide like bright insects through wet streets. There was no triumph in me, only air the kind that moves after you stop holding your lungs still. David joined me and said clarity would steady the teams. I told him to meet each property lead to say it plainly, that the work continues and that people who show up with care and discipline will always have a home here. He nodded, and the corner of his mouth lifted as if a weather front had shifted. That night in Queens, I told Elena what the board had done. She listened and then asked what I wanted the next years to look like. The question did not test me. It opened a field I had been staring at from the fence. I said I wanted the company to belong to people who treat staff like humans and clients like guests, not mirrors. She poured peppermint tea and said she had no desire to be anyone's mirror. We let the steam rise between us and did not fill the quiet with promises we did not need. The decision arrived without drama, the way a door opens once you find the latch. In the morning, I met with our attorney in a conference room that smelled faintly of paper and ink. Mabel Ortiz laid out the documents with her familiar care tabs, aligned dates clear. We drafted a transfer of 20% of Lawson Hospitality to Elena Torres. Not a trophy, not a favor, a vote of confidence tied to a development plan that would put her inside every division for a year. She would learn kitchens and receiving docks the front desk at midnight, when patience is a skill and a shield ballrooms before dawn, when linen carts roll and floor polish sharpens the air. The shares would be voting shares because anything less would be theater disguised as generosity. I crossed the lobby to meet her. She had come straight from school with a canvas tote and a stack of papers to grade. We rode up together. In the quiet room, Mabel summarized the document in simple language. Elena listened and asked questions that landed true. How double-turn events are staffed without burning people out. How linen losses are tracked across properties. How night managers are trained to lower the temperature of a problem without surrendering authority. She was not seeking a spotlight. She was locating the bones of the building. I slid the pen across the table. Her hand did not shake. She wrote her name with a careful stroke and looked up. In her eyes there was no hunger for display, only responsibility bright and clear. The click of the pen cap sounded larger than it should. Mabel gathered the signed pages and placed them in the folder with precise fingers, then excused herself to file the record. The door closed softly. We stood by the window and watched traffic braid itself below. A delivery truck found the curb, a cyclist threaded a thin seam between taxis, a pedestrian held her coat closed with one hand and her coffee with the other. The city did not know that a line had shifted in a room above its noise, that a woman who had never asked for anything now carried a fifth of a company on her shoulders like a promise she intended to keep. Elena said she would make mistakes and would not hide when she did. I believed her in the way you believe a weather report when the sky already matches the words. The next days filled quickly. Elena shadowed managers at our Midtown hotel before sunrise and sat with housekeeping at 6 when radios crackle and carts rattle. She walked the receiving dock and watched a delivery go wrong and be corrected without voices rising. She stood beside the front desk through a late check-in wave and watched patience loosen 3 separate tempers. In the evenings, she came to Queens and set her tote on the chair with the stubborn spring and told me what she had learned. I gave her my notes sparingly and let her field expand on its own. There is clean joy in watching someone you love settle inside competence. The board posted the revised succession plan to the secure portal. The language was plain. No theater. Just names rolls. A path that made sense. Staff realized quickly this was not a gesture for show. Elena's rotation calendar appeared alongside executives on internal schedules. People introduced themselves to her not with flattery, but with pride in their work. She listened the way good teachers listen until the person in front of them hears their own best answer. We took small moments where we could. A coffee in the lobby with a line cook who wanted to explain why a certain burner always misbehaved. 10 minutes in a service corridor to hear a housekeeper describe the trick for calming a guest who cannot sleep in a strange bed. A quiet nod to a night engineer who had coaxed an old boiler through a cold snap once again. Elena absorbed details as if they were seeds. She did not rush to conclusions. She allowed the garden to show where it needed water. A week after the signing, we sat on the roof of the Midtown property with paper cups of tea and the city thrown wide. Wind worried the edge of our napkins. The sky held to that late afternoon color that refuses to choose between blue and gold. I told her the company will outlast me only if it stays honest about who keeps it standing. She said we would keep the promise first in the smallest rooms, the places guests never see. I looked at her and felt a future take its full shape. It did not glare. It did not ask for applause. It stood on its own feet with her posture and my stubbornness, and a shared understanding that a boundary once held can become a foundation, and that from foundations you can build. We rode the elevator down with the daisies between us, and the day folded itself into ordinary hours. I learned the small choreography of having a daughter beside me. Elena texted after last period to say she was on the train. I kept peppermint tea in the pantry and a folded throw on the back of the couch with the stubborn spring. At night, she graded essays at my kitchen table while I read contracts with a pen that finally felt like a tool and not a shield. The air changed. It smelled less like old coffee and more like something living. At the office, the pace steadied. David met with property leads and spoke about care and performance. Managers who had carried the worst weeks on their backs stood straighter. The board posted the updated plan, clean language without drama. Phones that once rattled with demands now carried practical questions and simple answers. I slept through the night and woke to light that looked kind. Elena met me at the Midtown Hotel and we walked back corridors while housekeeping rolled carts and engineering checked boilers. She asked how linen is counted when a ballroom flips twice in one day, and listened with the attention of a teacher who has shown children how to follow steps in a lab. A server invited her to shadow a tasting. She said yes with quiet eagerness that wins allies. I stood a step behind and let rooms open for her without my hand at her back. It was better that way. Paperwork moved where it needed to go. Lawyers filed what the vote required. Shares were transferred as promised. Elena began a rotation across divisions that started at dawn on the loading dock and ended past midnight at a front desk, when a delayed flight pushed a wave of tired guests through the doors. She learned how a bad gasket can sour a Saturday, and how patience on a radio can save a shift. She came back to Queens with a tote that smelled faintly of lemon polish and kitchen heat, and told me what she had seen. I kept my stories short and let hers fill the air. There is a calm that comes from watching someone you love find the joy inside competence. Attention drifted to new scandals. Consequences stayed. I did not hear from Daniel for weeks. Silence no longer frightened me. One afternoon, a letter arrived at reception in a plain envelope. The desk called up. I said send it. Inside was a page written in the firm, careful print Daniel used at 12. He said he was sorry for the way he spoke and for the way he failed to speak. He said he had started at a small firm that did not ask about headlines. He said he knew the shares were gone and that it was right. He said he would try to live in a way that did not ask me to fix him. I read it twice and set it in a drawer. Forgiveness is not a switch. It is a hinge that needs time and oil. I would not force it. I would not throw it away. Olivia posted a long caption that used the words accountability and growth, and then fell quiet. I did not look for her name again. The internet does not get to be a character in my family. On a Tuesday that tasted like rain, I sat with counsel and signed the documents for the foundation I had carried in draft for years. We called it the Silent Seat Foundation because some humiliations happen at tables where you were supposed to be welcome. The charter was simple. Scholarships for hospitality students who work 2 jobs and still show up early. Small emergency grants for hourly staff who meet a sudden need with no cushion. A fellowship that trains planners and managers to keep dignity intact when rooms get loud. Elena read the packet that night with a pen and told me where the language could be kinder and where the numbers needed a decimal moved. We set a date for a quiet announcement. No gala, a release, a page, an application that did not ask for anything that could be used against people later. The announcement landed clean. Partners we trust matched funds. A culinary school in the Bronx asked for seats in the first cohort. A union rep sent a note that said, "Good policy is cheaper than turnover." I saved that line and read it again when the afternoon grew long. Elena insisted that the first scholarship carry no name. Memory is not a logo. It is a duty you carry with care. I agreed. The first stipends went out in May. I watched a pastry cook in our Brooklyn kitchen receive one and tried to hand it back until her manager told her it was not charity. It was respect. She cried without noise and finished icing a cake that had to be perfect for a couple who would never know how hard a day had bent itself to serve them. I walked to my office with the feeling you get when a valve opens in a system that has been running too hot. We marked small milestones. Elena sat as a bored observer and asked 2 questions and knew when to stop. I took a weekday afternoon off for the first time in years. We sat on a bench near the river and split a pretzel and watched a dog fail joyfully at catching a pigeon. Elena said her students were writing final essays on journeys they had not expected to take. She said she reminds them that journey is not a magic word. It is just the name for doing the next right thing enough times that it adds up. I told her I wanted that sentence on a wall. Summer pressed warm against the city and made nights loud. Staff began to bring Elena the kind of questions that signal trust. Could we stagger night shift breaks so someone could catch the last train home? Could conflict training include a section on bias that teaches technique and not just slogans? She took notes circled back with answers or with a timeline and credited the person who asked. It was unimpressive in the best way, the way that builds a floor. On a Sunday, I had promised myself and never kept. We drove upstate to a property I bought in a season that hurt. The ballroom where I once slept on a cot during renovations had become a room where light found its own angles. Elena walked the perimeter as if measuring the space against a plan in her head. She said the sound held in the shallow arches, and the chandeliers were almost too much but not quite. I asked if she could hear music. She nodded and started naming songs. I listened and heard them too. We hosted a small luncheon there for the first silent seat cohort. No speeches, just chairs and plates, and a long table where the point of the day sat in the seats and not on a stage. I stood at the edge and watched Elena move from cluster to cluster, introducing line cooks to housekeepers, to dispatch to florists, translating job titles into stories until the edges softened. The future of the company looked like faces lifted from the shadows and set in their right light. Near dusk, the sky thinned to a pale gold band. Elena said she would take the early train and still make first period. I said I would drive and that I was not ready to leave the quiet. She laughed and said the couch with the bad spring would still be there when we got home. The ache in my chest stretched and did not tear. It felt like healing feels when it is honest and slow. Before we left, I walked the empty floor one more time and pressed my palm flat on a table. Years ago, I thought revenge would sound like thunder. It does not. It sounds like a boundary held in daylight and a private room where love returns and takes a seat. It feels like a daughter steadying a pen and a name written without shaking. It looks like a company ready to outlast me because the right hands are on the work. If this found you at the right time, tell me what line you will hold and what you are building next, and stay with me for the next story so we can walk the distance together.